When I was 13, I went to a sleepover at my friend Tom's house. It was a huge old place, way bigger than any of our houses, with a steep, creaky staircase and those heavy wood doors that made the whole house feel kind of like a museum. Tom's family had only moved in a few months before, and the place was still full of empty rooms and weird, dusty antiques they'd inherited with the house. It had this vibe to it, like it was trapped in another time, you know? The kind of place where every shadow feels a little too dark and every noise echoes like it's coming from the walls themselves. Tom invited three of us over that night, me and two other friends, James and Kyle. We were planning to do the usual stuff, eat way too much junk food, marathon a couple of horror movies, and try to scare each other with whatever ghost stories we'd heard. But there was one thing we were all secretly looking forward to, something we hadn't actually talked about out loud: exploring the attic. Tom had mentioned it a couple of times, how it was locked when they first moved in, and that his parents hadn't even bothered to check it out yet. But he'd found an old key in the basement and managed to unlock it, and the way he talked about it made it sound like some forbidden room. I think we were all hoping to find something creepy up there, some weird artifact or old photo that would give us nightmares for weeks. So, naturally, as soon as Tom's parents were asleep, we made our way up to the attic. The door was at the end of a long hallway on the second floor, and every step we took seemed to make the floor creak louder. By the time we reached the door, we were practically holding our breath, listening to the silence around us, like we were about to break some kind of sacred rule. Tom unlocked the door, and we crept inside, his flashlight cutting a thin beam of light through the darkness. The attic was bigger than I expected, with low, slanting ceilings and a bunch of old furniture covered in dusty sheets. Boxes were stacked along the walls, each one labeled with someone's careful handwriting from decades ago. It was weirdly quiet up there, like the air itself was heavier somehow. As we looked around, I noticed something hanging on the far wall. It was a mask, one of those old-fashioned carved wooden ones. It had a long, thin face with these hollow eyes that seemed to follow you wherever you went, and the mouth was curved in this slight, unsettling grin. The paint was chipped, faded, like it had been there for years. "Whoa," James whispered, stepping closer. "That's creepy." Tom shrugged, trying to play it cool, but I could tell he was just as freaked out as the rest of us. "Yeah, it's probably just some decoration the old owners left behind." But as we stared at it, there was this weird feeling, like we weren't supposed to be there, like we were intruding on something. I tried to brush it off, laughing it away, but I couldn't shake the way the mask seemed to look back at me. After a few minutes, we left the attic, shutting the door tight behind us, and went back to Tom's room to watch a movie. I figured it'd be easy to forget about the mask once we got into the usual sleepover stuff, except I couldn't get it out of my head. The longer we sat there, the more those hollow eyes and that eerie smile crept back into my mind. I wasn't the only one. James kept looking toward the hallway, and Tom was quieter than usual, barely saying a word as the movie played. Kyle was the only one who didn't seem bothered, too engrossed in the horror movie to notice the rest of us. We tried to shake it off, but the whole vibe of the night was off, like we'd let something in by going up to the attic. Eventually, around 2 a.m., we called it a night. I rolled out my sleeping bag on the floor next to Tom's bed, while James and Kyle spread theirs out across the room. Tom was out in minutes, and I could hear the steady rhythm of his breathing, the soft rustle of his blankets as he shifted in his sleep. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to let the sounds of the house settle my nerves. But after a while, I started hearing something else. It was so soft, I thought I was imagining it, a subtle tapping sound, much like fingers drumming lightly on wood. I held my breath, listening, wondering if the others could hear it too. But nobody said anything. The tapping grew louder, and I could feel my heartbeat picking up. Then it stopped. I told myself it was nothing, just old house noises. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to relax, but the darkness felt heavy. I rolled over, my back to the door, trying to find a comfortable position when I felt it. That feeling you get when you know someone's watching you. My eyes shot open, and I lay there, every nerve on high alert. I didn't want to turn around, didn't want to see what might be there, but I couldn't resist my curiosity, and slowly I rolled over, peeking through barely open eyes. And that's when I almost had a heart attack. Standing in the corner of the room was a figure with the same hollow eyes and crooked smile as the mask in the attic. He was standing there, watching us. The mask's pale surface seemed almost to glow in the dark, those empty eyes locked onto me. I could barely breathe, my chest tight with fear, as I tried to process what I was seeing. It felt like an eternity, just staring at each other. I wanted to scream, to wake Tom and the others, but my throat was dry, locked in place by fear. Just then, Tom shifted in his bed, mumbling something in his sleep. The sound broke the spell, and I forced myself to sit up, my eyes fixed on the figure in the corner. But the moment I moved, he vanished. 1 second he was there, the next he was gone, leaving nothing but the darkness. I stayed awake the rest of the night, staring at that corner, waiting for any sign of the figure. I was sure he'd come back, that he was just hiding somewhere, waiting for the right moment. But morning came, and the room filled with sunlight, and everything looked normal, like nothing had happened. When the others woke up, I told them what I'd seen. James went pale, and Kyle looked away, clearly uncomfortable. Tom didn't say anything at first, just listened with this serious, almost scared expression. Finally, he admitted that he'd felt like someone was watching him too, but he'd brushed it off as nerves. Before we left, we all went back up to the attic just to check if the mask was still there. I don't know why, we all kind of hoped it wouldn't be, like that would somehow prove what I saw wasn't real. But when we got to the attic, it was exactly where we'd left it, hanging on the wall with that same eerie smile, like it was mocking us. None of us said a word, just stared at it, feeling that same heavy silence settle over us. I didn't want to touch it, didn't even want to get close, so we just left it there, locking the attic door behind us. To this day, I still see that mask in my dreams, the hollow eyes and that twisted grin lurking in the darkness. And every time I feel like I'm back in that room, staring at the figure in the corner, waiting for him to move. But the worst part? Sometimes, when I wake up, I could swear I hear the faintest sound of tapping coming from somewhere nearby. I can't say I was ever the scaredy cat type, but what happened that night at Amanda's house, it's still something I think about, even now, as a grown woman. I was 13, and it was a Friday night. Amanda and I had been friends for years, and we were the inseparable type, practically spent every weekend together. Her parents were these easygoing, trusting types who let us do our own thing as long as we stayed out of trouble. So when they told us they'd be out for the evening, having dinner in the city with some old friends, we saw it as a green light for a perfect night of freedom. It would just be me, Amanda, and a few other girls. Christy, who loved scary movies as much as I did, and Leah, who was a bit more timid but always down for whatever we suggested. Amanda's basement was kind of a regular hangout spot for us. It had this huge sectional couch that was more comfortable than any bed, a couple of beanbags we'd claimed over the years, and a low coffee table perfect for snacks and drinks. The basement wasn't creepy at all, really. It had enough light, and the walls were painted this warm beige color that made the place feel cozy. We'd all sprawled out in our sleeping bags, snacks spread out around us, completely alone in the house. The front porch light was off, the doors were locked, and Amanda's parents had left around 6, promising they'd be back before midnight. By 9 p.m., we'd already worked our way through most of a cheesy horror movie, laughing through the jump scares, eating popcorn by the handful, and daring each other to actually watch the creepiest parts. It was only after we switched to telling ghost stories that the atmosphere started to feel different. Christy was halfway through a story about a ghost who supposedly haunted our town's cemetery when we heard something. A faint creak, like a floorboard giving way under weight. I looked around the room, but none of the girls seemed fazed. I decided it was nothing, just some old pipe or random house noise. I figured I was on edge from all the horror talk. We kept going, and by the time we wrapped up another scary story, it was past 10. We were pretty deep in our spook talk now, telling each other about creepy things we'd heard or the worst nightmares we'd ever had. But then, out of nowhere, the sound happened again. This time, it was loud enough that all four of us froze. It was coming from above, directly from the kitchen, where the floor was hardwood and prone to creaking. But we were all downstairs, and Amanda's parents were gone. Leah leaned forward, whispering, "Do you guys think someone's in the house?" Christy gave her a little shove, laughing it off, but I noticed her eyes kept darting toward the stairs. Amanda rolled her eyes, trying to seem unaffected. "It's probably just the wind," she said, but I could tell she didn't believe it either. There wasn't even a breeze outside. We tried to keep the conversation going, tried to joke around, but the atmosphere had shifted. I could feel the hairs on my arms prickling, and the darkness upstairs suddenly felt more like a threat than just a part of the house. I thought about going up to check. I even stood up, halfway to the stairs, but then a new sound stopped me dead in my tracks. A voice. Not just one, but two, low and muffled, like a conversation being held just out of earshot. I looked back at the others. Their faces were all variations of shock and confusion. Christy leaned over, whispering, "Do you think your parents came home early?" But Amanda shook her head slowly, her face pale. "No," she whispered back. "My mom would have called or texted if they were coming home early." We all looked at each other, the fear now settling in thick. The voices were definitely not her parents. We could barely make out what they were saying, but one of them sounded angry, the tone sharp, almost frustrated. The other voice was more hushed, almost like they were arguing about something. Amanda whispered, "Maybe it's someone outside." But as soon as she said it, we heard a distinct thud, something heavy being set down right above us in the living room. That was it. Someone was definitely in the house. Panic started to take hold. I grabbed Amanda's arm, pulling her closer. "We need to call the police," I whispered, but Amanda just shook her head. "My phone's upstairs," she whispered, and I felt a cold pit form in my stomach. She wasn't the only one who'd left her phone up there. We'd all dropped them on the kitchen counter, thinking we wouldn't need them. Now they were upstairs, where whoever was in the house could see them. I was kicking myself for not keeping mine close by. Leah whimpered, and Christy clamped a hand over her mouth to keep her quiet. We all backed away from the stairs, huddling together, listening as the footsteps moved around upstairs. Whoever it was, they were walking with purpose, moving through each room like they were looking for something. I held my breath as we heard one of them curse, the sound muffled but tense, as if he was getting frustrated. The other voice was calmer, more methodical, giving instructions in a low tone. The footsteps continued, heavy and deliberate, crossing from the living room to the kitchen. We all kept our eyes on the stairwell, bracing ourselves for any sign that they were coming down. I could feel Amanda trembling beside me, her hand gripping mine so tightly it hurt, but none of us dared move. Then, out of nowhere, we heard a loud knock on the front door. The voices went silent, and we held our breath, straining to hear any hint of what was happening. Another knock followed, louder this time. I saw Christy's face brighten with hope, and she mouthed, "It might be the cops." We all waited, barely daring to breathe, listening as the front door opened. We couldn't make out exactly what was happening, but there were a few mumbled words exchanged, and then the heavy sound of footsteps fading away, the front door closing. We waited, just to be sure. And then, finally, the sound of Amanda's phone ringing broke the silence. She scrambled for the stairs, the rest of us close behind, as she sprinted up to the kitchen and grabbed her phone. Her mom was calling, and Amanda quickly put it on speaker, her voice shaking as she answered. Her mom's voice came through, calm but urgent. "Are you girls okay?" "Yeah," Amanda said, still breathless. "Mom, what happened?" Her mom explained that their next-door neighbor had called the cops after seeing two men sneaking around the side of the house. They'd thought no one was home and had planned to rob the place. The cops caught them just in time, right as they were about to come downstairs. I looked over at the other girls, each of us still in shock, the reality of how close we'd been to something terrible sinking in. When Amanda's parents came home, they hugged us like we'd been missing for days. We tried to explain what happened, but all we could really say was that we'd been alone, scared, and helpless, waiting in the dark while two strangers moved around just a floor above us. Even now, any small creak or faint voice sends me right back to that night. It's funny. People think the scariest things are ghosts or monsters. But that night taught me that real fear isn't something from a horror movie. It's real people, and it's real danger creeping just outside your safe place. I'm going to be honest, I never really believed in the supernatural. Ghosts, spirits, all that stuff seemed like it belonged in campfire tales and horror movies, not real life. So when my buddy Matt invited me over for a sleepover at his place, I wasn't expecting anything more than a night of snacks, video games, and maybe some late-night conspiracy theories we'd laugh about and forget by morning. Matt and I met during freshman orientation in college. He was easygoing, quick with a joke, and just the type of guy you could talk to about anything. So when he casually mentioned that he had a weird sleepwalking problem, I didn't think twice. He laughed it off, saying it was no big deal, and I figured he probably just walked around a bit or mumbled in his sleep. Nothing worth worrying about. That night, we hung out in his basement for hours, laughing and playing video games, tossing snacks at each other, just your typical guy's night in. His parents were out for the weekend, so we had the whole place to ourselves. By midnight, the energy in the room was winding down. We both yawned, stretched, and I was about to suggest we call it a night when Matt leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "So, I should probably warn you," he said, trying to keep a straight face but failing miserably. "Sometimes I do weird stuff when I'm asleep." I laughed it off. "Like what? You wander around the house with your eyes closed? Maybe raid the fridge?" He shrugged, a little too seriously. "Something like that." We set up our sleeping bags on the floor, and he made sure to position his at the opposite side of the room. I didn't think much of it, but as I lay there in the dark, staring up at the shadows on the ceiling, I couldn't help but wonder what he'd meant by weird stuff. Before I could give it much more thought, though, I drifted off to sleep. It was probably around 3 a.m. when I woke up. You know that feeling you get when something's off, but you're not quite sure what? That's what it felt like. The room was silent, the kind of heavy silence where you can almost feel it pressing down on you. I lay there for a moment, blinking, my mind half asleep, trying to figure out why I'd woken up. Then I noticed it, a figure standing near the door. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. Matt's basement wasn't exactly well lit, and shadows played all sorts of weird games down there. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it wasn't a shadow. It was Matt. He was just standing there, right by the door, looking straight at me. His eyes were open, but they were vacant, like he was staring through me, not at me. "Matt," I whispered, more to myself than to him. He didn't respond, didn't even blink, just kept staring, his body rigid, like he was frozen in place. I sat up slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements. I didn't want to spook him, thinking maybe this was just his sleepwalking thing. I'd read that you're not supposed to wake sleepwalkers because it could shock them, or worse. But the whole scene felt wrong. There was something off in the way he was standing, something unsettling in his stare. I cleared my throat softly. "Hey Matt, you okay?" That's when he spoke, and his voice sounded different, like it wasn't really his. "You shouldn't be here." It freaked me out more than I'd like to admit. His tone was flat, robotic, as if he was reading a line from a script. I waited, hoping he'd snap out of it, maybe laugh it off as a prank, but he just kept staring at me. "All right, man, this isn't funny," I said, forcing a laugh, but the sound came out weak. I was trying to shake off the unease creeping into my stomach. Then, suddenly, he turned and walked out of the room, just like that. No reaction, no expression, nothing. He disappeared into the darkness of the staircase, leaving me alone in the basement. For a moment, I just sat there, processing. Maybe he really was sleepwalking. Maybe it was nothing. But something in his voice, in the way he'd looked at me, kept me from lying back down. I grabbed my phone, checking the time, 3:14 a.m. I thought about just going back to sleep, but the weirdness of it all kept nagging at me. Finally, I decided to go check on him. I went upstairs and walked out into the hallway. His bedroom door was cracked open, so I peered inside. There he was, lying on his bed, his breathing slow and even, like he hadn't just been standing in the basement staring at me a few minutes ago. I backed out, deciding I'd just let him be. Maybe it really was just sleepwalking. The next morning, we both woke up like nothing had happened. I was debating whether to bring it up, wondering if he'd even remember. But before I could say anything, I noticed something strange. He had bruises on his arm, faint but noticeable, like someone had grabbed him tightly. "Dude, what happened to your arm?" I asked, half joking to cover my curiosity. He looked down at his arm, frowning. "I don't know." He rubbed at the bruises as if they were new to him. "I don't remember hitting it on anything." I tried to laugh it off, but it didn't feel funny. "Maybe you sleepwalked into something last night. You were acting pretty weird, man." He shot me a look. "What do you mean?" I told him about how he'd been standing by the door, just staring at me, and how he'd said, "You shouldn't be here." As I spoke, his face turned pale, his usual laid-back expression replaced by something close to fear. "That doesn't sound like something I'd say," he murmured. We both brushed it off, but the rest of the day felt tense. The image of him standing in the doorway, staring blankly, kept replaying in my mind. There was something unnerving about it that I couldn't shake, a sense that it hadn't really been him in that moment. A few days later, I got a text from Matt. He'd been having strange dreams since the night I stayed over. Dreams of standing in dark hallways, hearing whispers that weren't his own. He tried to laugh it off, blaming stress from school, but I could tell he was genuinely freaked out. I didn't know what to make of it. Part of me wanted to shrug it off, but another part wondered if we'd somehow stumbled into something we shouldn't have, even if it was just a creepy late-night episode. Whatever it was, neither of us could forget it. Now, every time I think about staying over at a friend's place, I hesitate just a little, because sometimes you can never really be sure who or what will be there with you in the dark. Back when I was 15, sleepovers at my buddy Ray's place were practically a ritual. His house was perfect for it. Big basement, plenty of snacks, and parents who didn't really care if we stayed up all night. They usually just gave us a blanket warning to keep the noise down and left us to our own devices. So one Friday night, it was me, Ray, and two other guys, Jake and Steven, all piled into Ray's basement with our sleeping bags and a bunch of horror movies. We were pumped for a long night of games, junk food, and trying to scare each other half to death. We just finished the first movie, some old slasher flick, when we started talking about real creepy stories we'd heard. Just normal teenage stuff. Urban legends, the guy who supposedly lived under someone's house for years, that kind of thing. But for some reason, maybe because it was late and the basement lights were dim, every little noise in the house seemed way too loud. And as we got more into our stories, our laughs turned into nervous chuckles. I'd be lying if I said we weren't a little on edge. Around 2 a.m., we heard this faint rustling sound coming from upstairs. It wasn't loud or anything, more like a shuffle or a soft thud. Ray immediately brushed it off as his dad getting a late-night snack, which seemed reasonable. The guy had the metabolism of a teenager, so we all laughed and went back to our horror stories, piling on more chips and candy. But a few minutes later, we heard it again, this time a little louder. It sounded like something shifting, like furniture being dragged across the floor, followed by a soft, almost rhythmic creak. Ray looked a little annoyed and muttered something like, "Geez, Dad, keep it down," under his breath. Jake and Steven chuckled, but I noticed their eyes kept darting toward the staircase, listening just as hard as I was. Then came the sound of footsteps, crossing the kitchen floor. We all stopped talking and stared at each other. It felt weird. Ray's parents weren't the type to wander around the house at night, and they definitely wouldn't be stomping around like that. He shrugged and tried to laugh it off, but I could tell he was getting a little freaked out too. The footsteps continued, and we heard them getting closer to the basement door. Then there was silence. The four of us waited, barely breathing, listening hard to see if we'd hear anything else. but everything was dead quiet. Ray's house wasn't old, so it didn't make the usual house noises at night. If something moved, it wasn't just settling, it was someone or something actually moving. "Should we go check it out?" Jake whispered, but none of us moved. I remember Ray looked kind of pale, like he was weighing the options in his head. Finally, he muttered, "It's probably just my dad, I'll go up and look." But as soon as he said that, we heard this loud thump, like someone had dropped something heavy on the kitchen floor. Ray froze. None of us moved. It was a kind of silence that felt thick, like we'd all suddenly realized something was really wrong. "What if someone came in?" he whispered. That suggestion hung in the air, and we all just stared at each other, realizing we didn't really have a plan if someone had broken in. Jake's face was pale, and Steven kept looking at the door as if expecting it to burst open at any second. I could feel the tension crawling up my neck, and suddenly, every shadow in that basement felt darker. Ray decided to be the brave one. "Look, let's just check it out together," he said, grabbing the flashlight with a hand that was clearly shaking. None of us wanted to go up, but none of us wanted to stay in the basement either. So, one by one, we crept up the stairs, sticking close together with Ray leading the way. Every step we took was like a test of nerves, each creak of the stairs making us flinch and look around. When we got to the top of the stairs, Ray turned on the flashlight, sweeping it across the kitchen. Everything looked normal. The chairs were in place, the countertops were clean, and the back door seemed closed. We all relaxed a bit, but the weirdness wasn't over. Ray aimed the flashlight at the back door, and that's when we saw it. The door wasn't locked. It was just slightly ajar, maybe an inch or two, enough to see a sliver of the darkness outside. "Did you leave it open?" Jake asked. Ray shook his head slowly, looking more disturbed than ever. "No, I locked it before we went to the basement. I always lock it." Without another word, Ray moved to close and lock the door. But just as he reached out, something outside caught his attention. He stopped, staring out into the darkness of his backyard. "What?" I whispered, stepping up next to him. My heart was racing, and I had this weird, tight feeling in my stomach. He didn't answer, just slowly lifted his hand, pointing toward the far end of the yard. I leaned in, squinting into the darkness, and that's when I saw a faint trail of muddy footprints leading from the gate to the back door. None of us could process what we were seeing. They were clear, unmistakable footprints, smudged and messy, but definitely human. They led straight up to the house, right to where we were standing. "Guys, those weren't there earlier, right?" "No way," Ray muttered, his eyes locked on the footprints. "I'd have noticed them when I checked the door." We all just stood there, staring at those footprints, trying to wrap our heads around what they meant. Someone had walked right up to the house in the middle of the night. Maybe they'd been inside the house listening to us talk and laugh. Ray locked the door, and we practically sprinted back to the basement, shutting ourselves in like it was the only place we could be safe. But even down there in the dark, it was impossible to feel safe. Every tiny noise felt like a threat. We stayed up the rest of the night, all of us too wired to sleep, just staring at the door, listening for any sound that might give us a clue that someone was still out there. But it was silent. By the time the sun finally started to rise, we were all exhausted, barely holding our eyes open. When Ray's parents woke up, they found the living room in utter chaos. Muddy footprints tracking across the carpet, some of the furniture out of place. They were sure it was us at first, convinced we'd been messing around in the night and left a mess. But we told them everything about the sounds, the footsteps, and finding the back door open. Even dragged them out to see the footprints. But by then they were barely visible, just faint smudges on the ground. After checking everything, his parents saw that nothing was missing. The intruder hadn't taken anything. Realizing nothing was missing didn't bring much comfort. In fact, the thought that someone had wandered silently through the house with us inside made Ray's parents freak out. They called the cops immediately. Officers came by, took our statements, and searched around, but they never found anything conclusive. We never did figure out who left those footprints or why they were there. Ray's parents ended up installing a security system not long after that, and we never slept in the basement again. The thought that someone walked around the house with us inside, silent and unseen, still gives me goosebumps. If these sleepover horror stories kept you on edge, hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life chills. Have your own spooky sleepover memory? Drop it in the comments. We'd love to hear your terrifying tales. Don't forget to hit that bell so you never miss another scary tale. And remember, when the lights go out, not everything stays at rest. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.